And we're live once more, which is fantastic. I'm delighted to welcome today Jonathan Pierce. And Jonathan is going to be with us every day this week as we embark on this truck campaign. Johnny FD, one of the other fantastic YouTubers, who's also involved in trying to raise money to get trucks for Ukraine. And in a minute, power and internet allowing, we'll be joined by Andrew Mercado as well. So we'll look forward to him joining the stream in a couple of minutes. And before we kick off, just to remind everyone what this is for. This is to help generate enough funds to buy a bunch of trucks for Ukraine. These are absolutely vital pieces of equipment to help get stuff to the front, to get people and equipment and stuff back from the front, especially wounded and so on. These are critical pieces of equipment at this time. We know that Russia's war is having a huge attritional effect on people, yes, but also on machines. So a fundraiser like this is absolutely critical. Johnny, welcome to the stream.
Yeah, Jonathan, thanks for having me. It's been a while. The last time I saw you was in Ukraine.
It was in Lviv last year.
Almost 2 years ago now, right?
A year ago, wasn't it? It was last summer, but a lot. Not this summer, past, but yeah, a year and a bit ago. But goodness, yes, a lot's happened since then.
This is going to be confusing because a lot of my mates call me Johnny. I'm Johnny, Jono, Jonathan, and we got another Jonathan and a Johnny. So I'm like, who is he talking to me? Is he talking to me? No.
We should call you Mr. Pierce, shouldn't we? Really, for this one.
Yeah.
JP's probably the easiest one. JP, that'll do.
Yeah, JP will be good, and then JFD can work out as well.
We're all in this campaign together, are we not? And I guess, shall I flash up the what's the best way of doing that? Probably that. That's the campaign as it stands at the moment. Jonathan, is it okay if I can just say something to my particular audience?
Please do.
We have reached the total of 2 trucks already. So I'm absolutely blown away with the awesomeness of my team. And I've just been speaking to the woman who organizes this and taken on board what you guys have said. And we're actually going to just keep our pot going up. So it's open, but it will feed into, we can choose someone like Canty or Phil, or, you know, help out with another one of the channels to help the whole total just be achieved by the right time. So our ATP target is kind of never ending, if you like, to some degree. Let's just keep going and keep raising that money for this amazing campaign. That's my bit.
That's incredible. Your audience is super generous for you to already have that so much before Christmas. My audience just started to donate, so I think I can't read it, it's a bit small, but just under €1,000 right now. So we're 8% of the way there. We have a little work to get there, but hopefully by Christmas we'll have that truck funded.
I've been blown away. I've got a couple of guys looking at data of like my audience, and I don't have as big as subscriber numbers as other people, but I've got a really, really involved audience. Like my team is, and it's probably, I spend an awful lot of time talking to them on my YouTube threads myself. My goodness, I spend a lot of time on YouTube. But I'm really honoured to have a really committed audience, and I think that they've really come through. So can I just take this opportunity to thank them? Thank you, team. You're amazing. But sorry, that's enough from me.
No, I want to say the same as well. I'm absolutely thrilled by everyone's chipping in. And I mean, some of the people on my audience will know that we're actually running 2 fundraisers concurrently. So of course, it's constant demands on people's attention, but they're very different ones. The trucks, I think, is very, very direct, and it's going to appeal to some people because you're actually helping literally to save lives with those, which is incredibly important. And as we all know, Russia is still throwing everything it has at Ukraine. Putin thinks he's winning. He's not going to give up. They're going to keep throwing North Korean soldiers into the mix. They're not going to stop until they're physically stopped. This hasn't quite sunk in. So the trucks for Ukraine is such a perfect giving thing. But of course, we also know that Russia is strong in the information warfare. So at the same time, we're fundraising to try and make a documentary film to counter Russian disinformation propaganda. Yeah. So that's the audience are being pulled in different directions. Yeah.
Yeah. One of the reasons why a lot of people have been hesitant to donate to Ukrainian causes in the past year is because of Russian propaganda saying, where's this money going? We need to be more accountable for the funds being donated to Ukraine. And unfortunately, that has caused a lot of people just decide not to donate at all. But what I really like about these truck campaigns is you see 10,000, euros goes in, one truck gets delivered. Another 10,000 goes in, another truck gets delivered. It can't get more concrete and solid than that. You even see, who it's handed off to. I've been fundraising for NATO 69, where we've fundraised for a bunch of trucks there, and me and Mercado actually just finished a campaign. We called it the Three Dragons. It was me, Mercado, and a guy named Kazakundi, one of the Mariupol defenders, and we managed to raise
I've read
3
his
trucks,
book.
and those just got delivered. Oh, have you? Yeah.
The book he wrote with John Sweeney.
Yeah, definitely recommend everyone check that out and see his backstory. But it wasn't easy to get 60 grand for those 3 trucks and some drones, and they're a little bit more fancy. They have all these bells and whistles like night vision and all that. And I personally didn't think my channel, even though it's number wise it's quite big, I don't want to say my audience isn't as involved in helping Ukraine with the war, but it was always primarily a entertainment channel. They wanted to see normal life in Ukraine. They wanted to see travel. They wanted to see things like this. They're not really as followed up on the war itself. So it's been a bit difficult. But when this campaign popped up, and for a bargain of 10,000 euros, we can get a truck. I thought, let's do this. We have to try this again.
Yeah. That transparency is so important, Johnny. I mean, a lot of the stuff you do, you're actually there on the ground. You're talking to real people. In some ways, it cuts through all the geopolitical nonsense. It says, look, these are real people. This is what they're up to. This is, I think, is what this campaign does as well. And what Jonathan and I were saying is that what we're going to try to do is actually drive these things over. Get to the garage in Lviv, meet the people, see how they put the armor plates in to protect, the limbs of the people who are driving them. If that's that point of proof, I think is incredibly important for campaigns like this.
Yeah, absolutely. I love it when they're transparent and you can see it, and I love the handover. Yeah, I'm super excited about the whole process of hanging out with you, Jonathan, and convoying across to where these things are needed. I think it's going to be brilliant.
It's going to be cold too. It's going to be in January sometime. So dress warmly. I mean, Johnny can tell us about that because he's been through the Ukrainian winter and survived.
Yeah, actually, this winter started in November, so it's been about a month and a half already, and I think we had our first snowfall before Thanksgiving this year. It was right around that time. I remember just being very happy to see at least some snow. I love the beautiful winters, the beautiful snowfalls, the white Christmas, but this year particularly it's going to be very difficult because of the power outages. Russia has been bombing Ukrainian infrastructure for the last 2 years. The first year in 2022, it was a very, very hard. Sat through the worst of it, and then I left right when spring was around the corner. But last year, I decided, you know what, I don't want to be here consuming valuable resources, consuming electricity. I'm going to take off somewhere warmer for winter. But ironically, last year, we had enough support where, we were pretty much without outages. But this year, it's going to be a hard one.
Yeah, and I wonder whether the weather makes a difference as well, because I think there's been a couple of relatively warm winters, if I remember correctly, the last couple of years, and it depends. I guess if it's a much colder winter, then that'll have even more of an effect on the population.
I guess as well with the deficit in patriots.
There's a
lot of energy infrastructure was taken out.
I was surprised. I was really surprised when it got through because that was always kind of priority number one to protect. And one day when we woke up and we found out that half of the electrical infrastructure has been destroyed, it was a big shock, to be honest.
Yeah, yeah, madness. And then, yeah, it's just it's that difficult conversation as well, because or difficult moral discussion concerning war about whether energy infrastructure is a legitimate target for a military to strike, and generally is accepted as a target. But I guess it depends what your intentions are. So, you know, if you're trying to take out energy infrastructure to affect like the manufacturing of military vehicles or whatever, then that's slightly more acceptable than taking out energy infrastructure to try and break the spirit of the people and cause civilians as much hell as possible, which is kind of what the Russians appear to be doing with everything they're doing, I suppose.
I mean, the biggest problem with war in general, and especially when Russia is the one fighting, they like to make a mockery of our democratic system and our rules by kind of, sliding along them, saying, "Look, we are gonna, we Russia are going to basically laugh at your rule, do what we want, but always give some BS excuse on why we're doing it. We're gonna bomb these hospitals because you're treating soldiers there. Now it's a military hospital. We're gonna bomb the school. Because there's students being trained. And in 5 years they're gonna join the military. And they're always gonna find some BS fine line where they can argue this is about military target, but in reality, they shouldn't be bombing anything in Ukraine. They shouldn't be invading Ukraine in the first place, and that's something I always want to remind people.
Yeah, I think that asymmetry has existed right the way through this war, where Ukraine, for you could argue it's for the moral reasons, but also practical reasons. If they start doing things like Russia do them, then they'll get punished by international aid not coming through to them. So if Ukraine do to Russia what Russia do to Ukraine, they'll stop receiving aid. So they have to play by the rules, and they're doing everything by the kind of Geneva Convention and doing it all, properly as much as they can. And that must take an awful lot of restraint, because they have in their units people who have been executed by Russians, right? And horrible things. Friends will have been tortured and killed, and they want to exact revenge. It's a very human reaction, and yet they're having to restrain themselves because they know that if anything bad gets out, they're going to get hammered in the international press. But Russia can just go around doing what the hell it likes. And
Johnny, you speak to Ukrainians every day. I mean, it must be the case, because I know those I interact with in London and Oxford have said that, like, literally every family knows someone who's been killed, knows someone who's missing, knows someone who's at the front, and they're getting sort of news about how terrible those situations are, or other terrible stories. Every single family will have it. Every single person will have friends from school who have been killed, who are going through these things. So it's not something that's remote from Ukrainians. Every single person has multiple examples of the results of Russian aggression.
Yeah, 100%. And what's really sad is, I think in the first 8 months or year of the war, everybody recognized that all Ukrainians are being victimized. They didn't want this war. They're being attacked by them, fleeing the country, going to Poland as refugees, or um, or asking for aid. It was not only expected, but it was welcome. But now, almost 3 years into the war, it seems like a lot of people, that empathy has ran out, and a lot of times, there's memes now about Zelensky begging for more money, or Ukrainian refugees overstaying their welcome, and it's a very sad spin, where the people who need them the most, they're the ones who supposedly Russia came to liberate. I mean, it's ironic that 99% of the homes that are destroyed, were those in Russian speaking places. People from Mariupol, from East Ukraine, in Kharkiv, those were primarily Russian speaking people that Russia, destroyed their homes and their lives way more than anybody in the West, or anybody who in Kiev or in any other big cities.
Interesting comment here from Inner Hype saying, we spoke with with friends in a fruit picking community at the start, and the Russian fruit pickers said Russia would target residential areas for a psychological effect. And that's something that they've done throughout the course of the war, but it doesn't always work to break people's spirits. Certainly initially, if you think back to the Blitz, not that any of us were there, but the Blitz in London in World War II, where the city of London was hammered by the indiscriminate bombing of the Germans to try and break the spirit of the British, but it actually brought them together in a kind of unified fortification of spirit against the Germans, and that certainly happened initially in the war. I don't know whether 3 years later there's a difference in morale. I don't know if Johnny, where are you at the moment? Are you in Ukraine now?
So I was in Ukraine exactly 1 week ago. I'm traveling now. I'm going to be spending the winter summer a lot warmer. Ironically, because our airport's not open, hasn't been open for the last 3 years now. I have to go through Poland or another neighboring country just to get out. So for the last week, I've been basically traveling through trains and buses and flights to get out of the country for the winter.
So have you noticed a change in morale of the Ukrainians at all over the last?
Yeah, 100%.
Yeah.
I mean, it's very sad. It's not about the morale of fighting. A lot of it is how things could have been done differently or better. For example, everybody who wanted to volunteer to fight has already volunteered. Those people have now been fighting for 2.5, almost 3 years, and they need to be rotated. But the problem is, everybody who didn't sign up the last 3 years, they in their mind already decided that they don't, that they don't want to go to the front. And because Ukraine is trying their best to keep their country together and not be, Russia, where you just, hiring mercenaries from North Korea or from places in Africa. It's kind of what we had mentioned earlier, where Ukraine's trying to play by the rules and trying to think what's best for the country. A very easy example is, a lot of people don't realize, but the Ukraine's conscription age is starting from 25, and you would think it would be 18. Any other country at war, especially one being invaded by Russia, they would be conscripting 18-year-olds all day. But very early in the war, President Zelensky said, we don't want to put our youth through that. They're not ready to have that mental torment. They have their whole lives in front of them. Also, if you look at their demographics, the birth rates between those years were very low, and it would destroy their future. So they've been very hesitant on conscripting anyone under 25. And by having this logical but also empathetic view on the future of Ukraine, it's also preventing them from having more people enlist. Ukraine also doesn't want to destroy the economy. Yeah,
there's pressure come from the US to change this, which I'm gonna say, something here people might find controversial. There's an element of unthinking cruelty, I think, behind those who are putting pressure on Ukraine to change this. If all of the munitions were given those people, whether they're 18, 19, 20, 21, etc., if they would go in the army and have everything they needed, then maybe, there could be a case to drop it a little bit. But Zelensky come out and said, look, we've got a number of battalions we've pulled together, and they do not have the equipment. So I think there's an element of cruelty there, just to sort of try to force Ukrainians to do this, while at the same time not giving them the tools for the job.
Yeah, it's hugely frustrating. I never know quite what's true, because there's all this talk about reserve units, and then only 2.5 out of the 10 units have been equipped. But you're like, so do they have like 7.5 units just sitting around twiddling their thumbs with no equipment, or is that do you know how much is true there? How much it does? How many units do the Ukrainians have backed up? And then you hear today, I was hearing that the EU is due to train another 12,000 troops by the end of this year. Like that's a couple of weeks away. Like, so are there more units to come off the conveyor belt there, and the training conveyor belt? And are they going to be equipped? I wonder.
There's a lot of people in Britain as well. I mean, there's training ongoing, isn't it? Continuous training, and so I guess there's a slight hand. I think since the ghost of Kiev and the sort of the propagandist myth around that, I think they've decided not to tell out and out falsehoods or to involve any kind of myth making and propaganda. So I think when Zelensky says something like this, it's true, but it's probably not the whole story, as you say. There's probably some detail underneath which adds some context. But I think if you read every word for word that Zelensky says, he also smuggles in broad daylight a lot of truths into his speeches that people just don't see. They miss them. So I pay very close attention to what he says there, because I don't think he will lie. But there's a lot of interesting stuff that just sort of goes under the radar.
Yeah, sorry, that's by the end of winter, which gives it to the end of February. So is that right? Yeah. So that's the end of February. So there's another 12,000 though by the end of February. That's quite impressive if that's the case.
And you have to ask what these North Koreans are doing. I mean, there's so many pictures coming out of them. And it's also interesting because it seems that whereas we look at the Russian forces and we look at the daily stuff and we think, look, they haven't learned anything. But then you see Ukrainians coming into the field, and they're apparently getting wiped out. And it shows that actually maybe the Russian army has learned a few things, learned a few techniques. It's brutal and brutish, but it's a little more sophisticated than it was, say, 2 years ago. But it seems that they have not communicated or trained up these North Koreans, or somewhere along the line, there's a disconnect, because these guys they don't have electronic warfare equipment. They're not coming in with drones. They don't have any of the sort of techniques that make the sort of current meat waves partially successful. One wonders, how this is going to pan out, and how many North Koreans are, getting ready to make that journey into Europe.
Here's a video of North Koreans, supposedly 100 of them, in a hospital in Kursk, in the city of Kursk. So yeah, there seems to be ample evidence now that the North Koreans are involved. They are on the front lines. They are being attrited, and we've seen. I mean, I reported the news that they were, and Zelensky made references last night that they were burning the faces of the North Koreans in order that they couldn't be recognized as being North Koreans after they died on the battlefield. I mean, if that's true, and there's a video of a burning face, so like somebody's face is definitely burning, and Zelensky mentioned it, so I figure that is probably true. But my goodness, how horrible is that?
Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't be surprised.
Russia can't go any lower, right? There is no bottom to this barrel of unpleasantness.
Russia doesn't even treat their own soldiers well. How could we expect them to treat North Koreans well?
Yeah, 100%. Here's another. North Koreans in a hospital there, again in a clinic in Kursk. So yeah, there seems to be ample evidence, as I say.
I guess these guys are in some ways lucky to even make it to the hospital, because there are plenty of videos out there of Russians who are clearly, extremely badly wounded, didn't get treatment in the field, minimal treatment when they made it back, and then they get their not enlistment papers, but get their papers to send them back to the front when they can barely even sort of stand up and so on, and full of holes. So these guys aren't coming back. I mean, I think there's no question, there's no intention, whether it's Russians or North Koreans. If you get them to this killing zone, if you get into this sort of open air gulag that Putin has created, there's no intention for any of these guys to return home and have a normal life.
Well, that's a really important question. So what are your thoughts on North Koreans being able to return home? They've now experienced, I mean, we've seen those stories of North Korean soldiers getting addicted to porn on the internet. That's the first place they went to when they got like open internet on phones in Russia. And then you see videos of them enjoying themselves, so to speak, and all sorts of stuff going around. You're thinking, will Kim Jong-un want these North Korean soldiers to return to North Korea, given that they've experienced what the outside world, even if it's Russia and it's not a perfect example, they're going to be kind of ruined, if you like, as far as Kim Jong-un's concerned.
Yeah. Stalin gives a good example. I mean, so many troops, especially the ones that were not necessarily involved in taking Berlin, but those who were captured and held as prisoners of war, they went straight from the Second World War up to Arctic prison camps. So, I don't think the intention is there for any of these guys to return. But also, Putin must be keeping an eye on his own regime stability. Would you want literally hundreds of thousands of maybe wounded and certainly psychologically wounded people who've seen the reality of his pointless war? They may not come back and have any sympathy for Ukrainians, but they may well come back and critique the incompetence and callousness of their own officers and the corruption they've seen all around them. He doesn't want any of these back on home turf.
Yeah. Well, actually, South Korea might take them. A lot of people don't really realize this, but when I talk to my Korean friends, I ask, what do you think about North Koreans? I would have expected a little bit of hostility or saying, oh yeah, those evil people or those idiots. But really, they always talk about North Koreans with a lot of empathy, saying they're us. They just happen to be on the wrong side of the line when the borders closed, and everything they're doing is not their fault. They've been brainwashed. We would welcome them back to South Korea anytime.
Interesting. There are stories that they're operating with those 80-year-old, what are they called, Nugent Mosin guns, or what, I forget the name of them, but like more than 80 actually. Those guns I think were designed in 1891, and they're supposed to be using those to attack. But as Michael Silberg here says, are the North Koreans being under-equipped deliberately because they can't be effectively motivated with the use of backing troops? So to keep the motivation for backed troops, I don't know. I would suggest they would. My mantra is always, you would if you could, so you can't, so you aren't, so you can't. Which is to say, I'm sure they give the North Koreans the best weapons they possibly could if they had them. You heard these horror stories of Russian troops getting those same rifles back earlier on in the war, and I just think there's a lack of equipment. For the Russians, as much as there are, of course, very well equipped units, and this isn't across the board. But I think that the reason why they're going to North Korea is because they need that equipment themselves.
Mm-hmm. But also, a lot of the Russian soldiers don't like the North Koreans. But Russians in general, especially Russian soldiers, or have been quite racist even amongst other Russians. So when you have the Buryats from the east, or the kind of the more Asian Russians, they were always treated much worsely than the traditional Slavic Russians. They were always sent into the meat grinder first. They were always under-equipped. They were always not taken care of. So when you have North Koreans coming, do you think that the North Korean commanders are going to want to give them good equipment and good defensive training? They're going to say no, just divide suka, just go in, see what happens. Worst comes to worst, you all get shot, but now we know where the Ukrainians are hiding. We know their positions. We'll figure this out eventually.
I think that's it. It's going to be a mixture of incompetence, isn't it? It's going to be a mixture of poor communication, where Russian officers are not communicating with their North Korean counterparts. They're not teaching them about the latest techniques. And there's definitely that kind of incompetence thing going on. But I really, like what you said there, Johnny, I think there's also going to be like this attitude of screw them. These guys have come over to save Mother Russia, but no one really gives a damn about it. And add to that the racism, which is very deeply embedded within the broadly speaking, the Russian psyche,
and there's that also. I don't know that it's not. I don't think it's racism, but there's that idea that BRICS is a very uncomfortable relationship. It's a marriage of convenience where Russia doesn't really like China. China doesn't really like Russia. China would like land off Russia. Russia have seen China as a threat. Like didn't they have all their air defense, like S-400s lined up on the Chinese border before they had to bring them across to Ukraine, because that's what they were wargaming against, which is a Chinese invasion, not, and so there's no love lost, particularly between the Russians and the Chinese either.
A lot of the old tanks and artillery were all embedded down there in the southern border. They didn't have the stuff on NATO's borders. This is why this argument, like that Putin was triggered by NATO, they thought Ukraine was going to join NATO. I was speaking to Leslie Dubenko earlier, and she's read some stuff. She's even spoken to people who are inside the Russian government, and in candid moments they say, well, of course NATO was never going to invade, and of course Ukraine was never going to be allowed into NATO. They knew that was never going to happen. I mean, they've made it far more likely through their actions, but you just have to look at, not listen to their words. You have to look at their actions. They clearly didn't fortify the Russian NATO borders because it wasn't a threat, not in any way whatsoever.
And even now, with Finland joining and having a long border, I don't think they moved a single troop there.
Well, actually, even worse. Worse for them. They removed a bunch of stuff shortly after Finland joined. They actually removed a whole pile of troops from the Finnish border, as if somehow joining NATO actually made that border more secure for them and less likely to be a threat.
Whilst at the same time creating or saying that they were creating a whole new military district for that area, like some St. Petersburg military district or something. It's like, you don't have the troops, you don't need the equipment for that. But yeah, absolutely. It's all a bit of a joke.
More smoke and mirrors, isn't it? It's just Russian bluff, the Potemkin facade of...
I mean, that's been Russia's power everywhere in the world. I mean, look what just happened in Syria, where, Russia was parading around for the last decade, saying, we're so tough. We're gonna protect this regime. Don't mess with us. And as soon as there was any rebel resistance, they just left.
This is it, Johnny. I want to ask you about negotiations, because there's a whole lot of stuff about negotiations. And whereas I think in looking at some of the social polls and data from 2022, 2023, Ukrainians were pretty much, don't give an inch to Russia, fight back. Now, of course, there is not just exhaustion, but there is the fear that, let's say, division within the West and the clear lack of strength amongst Western allies. If you just look at it in aggregate, I mean, we can find examples to say that's not true, but in aggregate, the Western response has been incredibly poor. Is it the case, do you think, that a lot of Ukrainians are looking at this and thinking, those territories in the East, as much as we'd want them back, and we will get them back one day, right now, a peace or a frozen conflict might actually be the better option? And I know a lot of Western allies are pushing Ukraine into that. What are your feelings on that one?
So I've spoken to a lot of Ukrainians about this. I mean, it's ironic, living in Ukraine for the last 4 or 5 years. The topic of war actually doesn't come up as often as you think it would. We in the West actually probably talk about it more often. But when we do talk about it, it's pretty concise, and because we don't have to explain all kind of the backstory of it. I think when Westerners are talking about the war or negotiations, there's a lot of nuance that you have to explain, before getting to your point. But with Ukrainians, they already understand, the whole history, the nuance of it. So to answer your question, it depends on the timeline. You're right. In the first year, it was don't give an inch. As soon as I think it was, when Ukraine's offensive took back Kharkiv and Kherson, there was motivation, and said, you know what, we don't just want these territories back, we want Crimea back as well. And that was always that was the goal, and say we're not going to stop until we get everything back. If you ask most people in Ukraine now, they'll say, you know what, let's talk about Crimea another day. Like it's that it's unfair, and legally incorrect that Russia took it. Let's not discuss that right now. Donetsk, Luhansk, most Ukrainians will say they're not ours anymore. Everybody who lives there is not, it's not us. They've been either brainwashed with propaganda. There are Russians who moved in. They're not our people anymore, and it's basically not even a discussion. Like, if Ukraine got everything else except for Luhansk and Donetsk, 99% of people said that's absolutely fine. Like, we weren't expecting that back anyways. But the most important thing that people aren't talking about enough is not about the land, not about the borders. It's about not having a frozen conflict like 2014, where Russia can kind of just brew in the background, fill up their coffers, economically, grow their economy, and rearm, train soldiers, and then come attack a couple years later. Because if that
And
does
attack
happen,
again. Yeah.
Unfortunately, if that happens again, nobody's going to come to Ukraine's side again. The West is tired after this is done. A pause. I don't think most people in the West are going to say, okay, yeah, let's do this all over again. This is it. We have to get it done correctly and make sure this never happens again.
And a pause, I mean, sorry, jump in, Johnny.
Well, I was just gonna say this is why it was number one on his victory plan list, wasn't it? So he said we need to be in NATO. NATO is our security, and if it's not NATO, it has to be something pretty much synonymous with NATO and Article 5. So maybe bilateral agreements with all these countries. But they absolutely need some formal agreement or a security agreement, because otherwise Russia will just come back and take a second bite of the apple. And it really frustrates me when people, particularly in America, go, oh no, well, they almost start with, well, they're not going to get a security guarantee, they're not going to get into NATO. Why are you starting like that's clearly what they need most, and you're saying straight away that's not what they're going to get? It really frustrates me.
And the idea that somehow there's going to be frozen conflict, and you've got the most intense warfare since the Second World War, and then suddenly the guns are going to fall silent, like in 1918. It's 11 o'clock and suddenly everything's over. That's not how Russia operates either. It is going to be causing diversions and distractions. It's going to be lobbing artillery shells across the border, saying Ukrainians have been, bombing themselves. The same nonsense.
False flags all the time.
Yeah. False flags, the whole kind of thing. And as you say, allies will be exhausted. The only perhaps, the only thing that perhaps could work in this circumstance, as you say, NATO, probably not going to happen. But if there's a similar organization like the Joint Expeditionary Force, get Western monitors, get Western troops onto the border of that frozen conflict, get Ukraine into EU and get them into something like the Joint Expeditionary Force, and then just turn it into a fortress. I mean, we have to be realistic that a negotiation, a treaty with Russia is not a thing. The only thing that works is force. And if you don't demonstrate force and strength, then they'll have another go. It's as simple as that.
100%.
This is why I was, as much as I want this war to end as soon as possible, it's funny that I get accused sometimes of being a warmonger because I'm helping the military, like with our campaign here. That thank you to everyone who's been donating so far. By giving the military trucks, it's not prolonging the war. It's not us being warmongers. It's to give people the tools to save their own lives on something that they would be doing anyway.
Yeah, you're breaking up for me there, Johnny.
Defending the country and the borders anyways. They might as well have the tools to do it.
Yeah,
they might as well have the proper equipment. I let you know trapped.
Oops, he's
lost
gone.
Johnny there.
Yeah, there's some pretty dodgy connections there from Johnny. I don't know if you can join us. So sorry, Johnny, you were really breaking up there. But I think the general point is that, and this isn't just about how we help Ukraine, for example, with campaigns like this, but actually internationally, you get these politicians who are accused of being warmongers or being hawks, right? But they're not actually. This is the best way to get justice and peace, is to arm Ukraine with as much as possible, to win the war as quickly as possible, and then you get engaged in a negotiation where Ukraine are in the power position, and then they can negotiate themselves the best outcome, since they are the victims here. Absolutely, Johnny, I completely agree with you.
I touched the 4G. Can you hear me better now?
Yeah.
Okay, great. Yeah. So as much as I would like this war to end, as soon as possible, what I don't want to see happen, and then what people in Ukraine don't want to see happen or can't see happen, is there to be a pause. A Minsk III agreement. Just a piece of paper saying, yeah, we'll have a ceasefire, but there'd be no repercussions if Russia breaks it. So it's one of those things where this war, like as you said, needs to have some kind of security guarantee from an outside force, whether it's NATO or the EU, whatever it is, or Russia needs to bleed enough where they never even think about invading Ukraine or any other neighbor again. And even though, I would love to see this war end next month or, tomorrow, Russia actually is digging themselves in such a deep hole that if somehow this war dragged on for another year, Russia is going to be in a way worse position than Ukraine is. And economically, I don't think they would recover the next 2 decades. So part of me kind of hopes that Putin is smart had enough to not do a good deal, and Trump steps up on January 20th and says, you know what, screw you, Putin, we tried to give you a good deal, but you don't want to, you don't want to leave Ukraine. We're going to give Ukraine everything they need to continue fighting. Russia, you can go ahead and crumble.
Trump has got the opportunity to be a real hero, to go down in the history books as facilitating Ukraine to really win this. Like, Biden's been and done. He's done the hard yards, and you can disagree or agree with whatever Biden did, but he's actually brought Russia to this point where I think it's incredibly weak, right, both militarily and economically, due to a protracted war that's lasted 3 years. And I've argued on my channel before that it wasn't the intention, although some people argue it was the intention by drip feeding to make sure that Russia was fundamentally weak. But I think it was anti-escalation. But the reality was, it's been paid for with Ukrainian lives. But you've got to a situation now, because the war has been much longer than it needed to be, Russia are actually fundamentally weaker than they would have been had this been a quick war. And so what you can now get is a situation where Trump could come in and take the crown in glory. It's like the one that finishes the relay race and then just, I'm the one that won this. Do you know what I mean? And he could take over, and that would play to his sense of ego and narcissism. But if he goes the other way, he will just go down in history as a freaking appeaser and just,
I think he wants to avoid that. I really don't think he wants to be known as, and talking to some experts in the area, they say that essentially Trump's policies set up the evacuation of Afghanistan. But when that actually happened, it happened in a chaotic fashion, but it was almost inevitable at that point. But of course, who's carrying the can for that? Whose reputation was severely dented by that? It wasn't Trump's, it's Biden's. And I think he's very mindful that he doesn't want to be the one to, to see the world fall apart on his watch. I also suspect he has a sort of certain understanding of gangsters and how they operate. And Putin is a fusion of the Soviet mentality combined with gangsterism. Those are the two things you need to understand his actions and predict what is going to happen next. I believe what's going to happen next is that however hard Trump tries to broker a deal, even if that deal is not particularly great for Ukraine, Putin is going to throw a spanner in the works at every attempt. He's going to use escalation and insult and war crimes to try and get more and more advantage. and then doesn't abide even if an agreement has happened, that inevitably, I think, is going to really piss Trump off. And I don't think, there are those obviously who are antagonistic towards him. I count myself as one of them, who say that he's just going to fawn to Putin. I don't think ultimately he's going to. He's not going to want to be made to look bad. And he's going to go to some of the good people around him, like Keith Kellogg, and say, okay, how do you make this guy stop? Just anything. Just what do I need to do to make this guy go away?
Can I, Jonathan, can I ask a question from the super chats? So Goose Springsteen's done a super chat and he's got a question. I'd be interested in what Johnny FD has to say about this, because he has got a better maybe understanding of what Ukrainians think about Russians. So the question, I've got the question or the statement, and then a comeback from someone else, and then yeah. So Goose Springsteen, thank you. That's an incredibly kind super chat there. So it won't be a popular point, but I think we need to be careful about essentializing Russians as being servile orcs. The same was said about Germans in the 1940s. We must believe it's possible that Russia can be a normal country. And Mark Galliotti has good points on this, he says. So in other words, we need to treat, Russians as fellow humans, and, they are maybe victims in this, that there's a chance that they can become a normal country and integrate with international society. Then Matt Bishop then says, I can't count how many, oh no, sorry, it's this one. As someone who's been on the receiving end of 2 Russian invasions, no, they cannot be a normal country. And so there are these 2 competing narratives about like what Russia is and how they are as people. I'll be interested in what both of you think about that.
Yeah, I mean, I'll jump straight in with my point of view. Russia is not a country, and it never has been a country. It's an empire, and it was constituted as an empire, and it does not have, in no period have you had, let's say a sort of ethnic Russian nation develop into an empire, as Britain did, for instance, and France and other places. It's always had at the basis of Russian identity the imperial mindset and imperial constructs come from top down. So I would never use the phrase servile orcs, but I would say that because it is lacking in experience of certain processes that have shaped Europe, it is not a normal country, and never has been, if you compare it to the European nation state. It has never been one of those. It's never been through the processes that allow it to be one of those, and those processes take many centuries. So Russia, as it's constituted, if it's constituted as a multi-ethnic empire, which it currently is, has never been normal, and it will never be normal, and it can never be normal. That's my take on that. If we're going to want to see it become more like Western European nation state, which Ukraine much better fits into that mold, you got to say, well, how's that going to be achieved? It could only be achieved by Russia being broken up into much, much smaller units, I believe, that would allow some of this organic politics to arise from the ground up. But even then, it's a slow process. It's going to take a long time, and it will never happen under current circumstances if it continues to be constituted as it currently is, with a guy at the top of the pile in a fortress in the center of Moscow controlling 80% of the country's wealth, and constituted as this really rigid, vertical, hierarchical empire. Essentially, it's not normal. It's never been normal, and it's very dangerous to pretend that it is normal or just could magically become normal. Unfortunately, the Navalny team, and some of them still do, seem to think that you can just miraculously transform into a nation state or something that Ukraine has had to. And Ukrainians will tell you they've sweated over generations, and it's a culture that takes many centuries to build up. And it doesn't happen by magic. It happens through a huge amount of passion, hard work, and sacrifice. And I don't see Russia being capable of making that change, and that change is impossible as it's currently constituted. Johnny.
Well, JP, thank you for sharing my link, by the way, to the donor box.
Yeah,
to
please
answer the
help out
question.
Johnny FDs. Help out all of them. Jump on and donate. It'll be absolutely marvelous if you can do so.
Yeah, I appreciate that. Before February 2022, most people in Ukraine, thought, what, Russians are they're just like us. They're, yeah, we've had problems with them in the past, but nowadays everything is normal. It's kind of very similar to how Americans feel about the Japanese, or Germans. Yes, in the history we've had wars and conflicts, and things were really bad, but now everyone's friendly, everyone's normal. There's no reason to be to look down on them, or we as humans have evolved. Uh, but if you ask me now, like, all the Ukrainians know hate Russians, and rightfully so. They've all lost somebody. They've all suffered because of it. They hate Russians so much that they can't even see future where they forgive them. And in Kyiv, one of the ways to kind of get my mind off of things, and we host a stand-up comedy night, like open mic. And one of the joke topics I wanted to bring up was, one day, Ukrainians will forgive the Russians, and and people were like, "Boo!" There's no way this never happened. And the punchline was supposed to be, my ancestors are Mongolian. Now when I tell people in Ukraine, I'm part Mongolian, they're like, "Oh, that's amazing!" And it's all positive feelings. But they forget that just down the street at Golden Gate, in 1432, my ancestors came, Mongolians came, looted, killed, raped, and just destroyed your city. Time, and not repeating those brutal actions has solved all wounds. So eventually, Ukrainians will stop hating Russians. But right now, the vast majority just they and I'll tell you why they hate them. It's not just because their government invaded the war, or some many of them are here fighting. It's everybody that could be doing something, and rising up against their politicians, rising up against the war. They all have an excuse why they don't. And I know it's difficult to stand up and protest in Russia, but you can't tell me that if 1 million Russians got up and protest at the same time, that Putin would be able to stop them. And when you're talking about the population of Russia, that's only 1%. If just 1% of Russians got together and protested and fought this, or just 10% of Moscow's population, there's a zero chance even Putin's guards, even Putin's military could put down 1 million people in the Red Square. So the fact is, they would have. If the situation was reversed and Ukraine had invaded their neighboring country, let's say Moldova, it's a little bit unrealistic for to invade a bigger country. But if Ukraine had invaded Moldova or Belarus, whatever it is, with the pretense of this is our historic land, there's Ukrainians there we need to protect, whatever BS reasons, Ukrainians would go to Maidan. 1 million of them would go to Maidan and say, "No, do not do this. You cannot come and destroy their homes. We don't need their land. Stop this war." And the fact that the Russians haven't done that, it's made Ukrainians not only hate them, but also not respect them the least bit.
And it just
compare
shows
that to Georgia, Jonathan. You've been seeing the protests in Georgia. Georgia's a country of just a handful of millions of people. I think it's 3.5 million, if I'm not correct.
Yeah.
And yet you've got hundreds of thousands turning up night after night in midwinter, in what is an unusually cold winter in Georgia. So again, you've reached this threshold of people prepared to say, "Look, I'm going to sacrifice my personal comfort. I'm going to sacrifice my personal privileges and whatever, and I'm going to go out and do something for, I'm going to protest for these values that I hold with my fellow citizens, because there are certain things which are, are non-negotiable, which is, stealing elections, non-negotiable, breaking promises, etc. And you get this movement. I'm not sure there's anything that would unite Russians enough to get any threshold number onto the streets. Even though the population is much higher, you wouldn't see a fraction of the people you've seen in Tbilisi. Remember as well, there's somewhere between 25 and 30 million Russian-speaking people in the diaspora, those who've left Russia over the last couple of decades. And I know of Russians who go to protests. I know of Russians who will say that they're actually Ukrainian by ethnicity, because the shame is so deep. They don't want to be associated with that. And I know those who just think it's generally a horrible business will go away. But 25 to 30 million, right? You haven't even seen a fraction of 1% of those diaspora Russians get on the street and say, hang on a second, we have values and these have been infringed. Because they don't behave like a citizenry. They're a population, right, with little in common.
All of what's been taking place in the last 3 years, but actually Georgia just recently, and Romania and Moldova has really reminded me how brittle, how freaking fragile democracy is, and how we should not bloody take it for granted. Each of us living in, like, I live in the UK, Jonathan lives in the UK, Johnny's obviously living all over the shop, but essentially in places that allow us freedoms that if you start losing them, and this is what I'm deeply worried about the next administration in the US, that if there are liberties that get chipped away at, they've been hard fought for, they're a long time in coming, and once you lose them, you can slide down, democratically backslide, and you end up being a Georgia, where people are struggling in a country that should be relatively not easy, but it's a smaller country. You can grind that country to a halt and hopefully affect a change with a mass of people. But when they are sending out internal security services onto the streets and stopping that happening, it's frightening. I am really frightened about how fragile democracy is. And I'm going to spam you here. Back in 2016, I wrote my first fiction book, which is Survival of the Fittest, Metamorphosis, and then the sequel, Survival of the Fittest adaptation there. I think you should all go and buy that for Christmas and tell me how you enjoyed it, which you will enjoy it. Of course you will. But that was to do with the pandemic. Funny that ended up happening. And it is kind of zombie, because that's a way you can get like philosophy into it, which is how society falls apart. But I looked at the London riots. You remember the London riots, Jonathan, where suddenly parts of London were on fire. Like, hang on, that was just like one person getting shot by the police in London, and it was horrific. But it was a spark that lit a fire, quite literally, actually, that showed how fragile law and order was in one of the greatest capital cities of the world. Our democracies are way more fragile. Our sense of law and order and our infrastructure for law and order is way more fragile than I think we understand. Anyway, end of soapbox.
No, I absolutely agree. And it has, I think the reason why I did not think this war would happen is I genuinely thought we were beyond that. We were beyond a society where we can't work out our problems. Nobody's suffering where, there's no country in the world that doesn't have enough food, that can't get enough food, in terms of, bad economics or corruption. That's a different story, but there's enough food in the world to feed the entire, to feed everybody. There's enough resources, there's enough wealth that no country needs more land. No country needs more anything. It's 1,000 years ago, I understood. If it was the survival of the fittest. If you weren't the strongest, if you weren't, if you weren't invading other countries for the resources, then you didn't have anything. But now we trade. Democracy isn't perfect, but it works. And the fact that the war started, the fact that Trump won, it really has blown my mind on what what is possible in our lifetime, and it saddens me, to be honest.
But funnily enough, I mean, this is a bit of a philosophical argument. Well, maybe it's a biological argument that actually, when you have oligarchies and dictatorships, that is survival of the fittest. That is going back to people wanting power. That is the alpha male status. That is people asserting their control over the pack, and then trying, because then you get into a situation that, like I've talked about this a lot, that no dictator really retires into a nice kind of like swimming pool palace and sits out the last 20 years of their lives. Very rare does that happen. They get arrested, sent to a gulag, executed. So, to exist for longer until you die naturally, you need to be in power all of that time as a dictator, broadly speaking, give or take. And so it's just, once you have that greed for power and you get that power and you put all those things in place so that you can't lose that power, and people are just, I look at Trump and think that he is just addicted to power. He loves that strong man power kind of sense. And I see this in these people, and that is a kind of survival of the fittest kind of mentality. Anyway, I'm going off on one. You get my point.
No, but speaking of mentality, not just in the U.S., it feels like all around the world, populism is rising again. Where especially in our democratic countries, where a leader can come, potential president, potential prime minister, whoever it is, they can just promise the world. They'll say, everybody's going to have more money. We're going to get rid of all these immigrants who are stealing your jobs. It's kind of the same playbook. We're gonna, everyone's going to have X, Y, Z and they're no longer talking about policies or how they're going to do it. They're just promising the world, and somehow that's good enough for people, to rob their emotions.
This is such an amazing area of discussion. Goodness me, this is like another 2 hours. But honestly, I do wonder, and I've talked about this before, why are we more susceptible now? Why are we vulnerable as society to these promises that are so simplistic? And is it because the life is confusing, that we are just bombarded the whole time, that actually we like clarity sometimes, even if that clarity is completely false, right? We love a simple solution to a really complex answer. In other words, Trump comes along and says, I'm going to solve Ukraine in 24 hours. As you say, Johnny, no idea. He doesn't explain how that's going to happen, but there's a simplicity there that goes, oh, brilliant. Well, that solved that then, because that's really complex and I can't really work out how that happens. And, is it because we are so used to living a life where everything has an immediate solution? Like if I can't get my internet goes down for like 5 seconds. I'm like, no, my life has come to an end. And if I can't order something off the internet and have it delivered in 24 hours, then that's just not good enough. And we have this immediacy, so that we're always just looking for a very quick solution. And if that solution isn't provided, then we go on to the next solution, which is why we are having so many governments that are only lasting one term before we then go on to the next one, because we're like, well, that didn't work, let's try a new one. Well, that didn't work, let's try a new one. And we've forgotten how to live a kind of a nuanced, slower, more complex life. Anyway, going off on one again.
We probably should just check in now. It seems that Andrew Mercado, who's supposed to join us, has had internet problems. So hopefully we'll get him up, not on this episode, but on one later in the week. And glad you pulled that up. Probably a good chance to have a reminder of the Trucks Under the Christmas Tree campaign. The fact that we are trying to crowdsource a bunch of trucks to send out to Ukraine. These have a huge, huge impact. And the whole journey of those and how they get fitted out is going to be followed. Again, this will help with transparency and so on. And I wanted to check, probably we'll be winding things up on this one, but we will be talking every day.
Can I? There's a couple of super chats that have actually one about you, Jonathan, which you might appreciate. So Goose Springsteen, and thank you again, Goose. I would love to see a debate between Fink and Galliotti on this. So this was going back to your discussion about whether Russia can change and whether they're a normal country. If it's possible for the USA to exist as a multi-ethnic democracy after slavery, Jim Crow, genocide of the natives, why not Russia? So why is Russia dyed in the wool, unable to change? Is there anything you would want to say to that?
It comes back to my point that it's not genetically incapable of doing that. And actually, quite often when you have Russians abroad, they fit into other countries with democratic systems, they do rather well. They follow the rules, they go and earn money, and they slip into the background. You wouldn't notice. So that it's not that it's incapable, and this is a specifically Russian thing, but you look at the political entity and the geographical entity. All I'm saying is that if it is constituted as it currently is, with the majority of wealth and power going to a small elite based on a very vertical, hierarchical, authoritarian system centered on Moscow, you will not see that change. My point is that these things could happen, but you'd have to, in some way, deconstruct the system that's been put in place there. And, some people may argue that there's not that many differences between the US and Russia. There's every difference in the world, I think. And the US has never had an institution such as the KGB. I mean, imagine, the SS surviving World War II and existing to the present day with all of the grimness that went along with that. Well, the KGB, FSB is the same kind of entity, and it survived from the darkest period of history. Unfortunately, you have to root that out like some kind of Japanese knotweed. You have to deconstruct the power vertical, or unfortunately, I would say there's no chance. I mean, where probably I think if we'd have debate, and I've asked this point to numerous people on the channel, how do you actually physically deconstruct a system like the one that's been built? And almost no one has the answer to that, I have to say. So
he's got another couple of questions as well. So I think in the West, we have been confronting the failure of centrist politics since 2008. Russia doesn't usually create issues, but amplifies real problems. You look at the house price to wage ratio. There is a thing about centrism, which is a kind of status quo, is that it's very difficult to powerfully defend centrism when you're going out to campaign, because actually people are much more attracted by the extremes. Like, these guys are terrible, we want this end of the spectrum, or these guys are terrible, we want this end of it. And that plays on our sense of one or the other. We're not very good at it. So I don't know that there has been that much centrist politics. I think we have seen a move to the extremes, and I think the world is reflecting that.
I suspect the sort of left, right, center can be quite a distracting thing. Whereas I think the real danger is when you slip from a society where resources are not distributed fairly, and they start pooling in different places, and then people who have those greater resources, start bending the rules and warping the system to defend what they've got. You enter into, I mean, he's not right on everything, but Yuval Noah Harari is talking very compellingly about this, which is when you get monopolies forming, whether they're powerful monopolies or economic monopolies, they will bend the rules in their favor, and you get into a kind of law of the jungle arms race. They why do they accrue when you've got $1 billion? Why do you need 2? Why do you need 4? Why do you need 5? Often that is to warp the rules in their favor so that doesn't get taken away, or to stop rivals coming up again that would chip away at your wealth. So I think the left-right aspect of politics can be a distraction, because I think there are intolerances and movements towards eroding freedoms in all areas of political spectrum. So rather than looking at the labels, I think we need to just ask simple questions like, is this enhancing freedom or is it not? Is it tackling the real underlying problem or not? The difference there is I think there are plenty of people in the US and the West of goodwill who are interested in doing these things, irrespective of their political spectrum. Unfortunately, I think the mechanics of freedom are very alien in Russia, and the culture of it is very alien. And this is another question there of how you create a more diverse and tolerant culture. It's not as simple as just fixing a political machine.
Before we sort of round things up, I mean, this is a huge question. Goodness me, I wouldn't know how to answer it. Goose Princeton, thank you very much for this super chat as well. Splitting the USSR and China was a great geopolitical achievement. If there is no eventual reconciliation between Russia and the West, is it possible to prevent the rise of China as Russia can provide China with energy and food. So this is like BRICS versus the rest of the world. And we can laugh off BRICS, but, you know, it's not about where BRICS is now, but about where it might be in 50 years. Can you see like China with Russia as its vassal state, basically saved by China in this war against Ukraine, becoming a provider for China that then becomes the great world superpower?
Yeah, or this one is suggesting, why don't we make our peace with Russia because it implies that China is the worst enemy. I would unfortunately suggest that's not the case. Out of the two, would you rather live in China or Russia? And I would say China. I would go and live in China, because if you don't dabble in politics in either place, there's corruption, there's all sorts of things. But you know, China has not come from a deep militaristic culture in its deep history. You know, it's come from a far more agricultural background. I do not see it as an aggressive militaristic entity in the way Russia is, and it's also not built its economy on extraction. It's not built its economy entirely on a parasitic mode of existence. It makes things, it builds things. It's got huge problems, of course it has. But the level of trust that needs to exist to create an economy like China's is very different from the level of trust between people to get to where Russia is. I find Russia to be the far more toxic entity than China. I think people will find that perhaps controversial.
I mean, I think right now China hasn't done anything, you know, at least in recent years, to if China started a war and invaded one of their neighbors in 2022, we would be having a different topic and different discussion. The fact that they just haven't done it yet doesn't mean that they're not, you know, they don't have the potential to be our enemy. I personally am very worried that in our lifetime, China is going to, you know, potentially start World War III. You know, and it could be as simple as, you know, invading Taiwan, which they've been talking about and threatening, you know, over and over again. You know, because the U.S. would have to get involved in that. You know, other countries would have to get involved in that. So, you know, we'll see what happens. You know, didn't think Russia would invade. I didn't think China would, you know, will invade, but I've been wrong more than once in the past 2 years, unfortunately. You know, this world isn't as peaceful as I was hoping it to be.
Yeah, I don't know China well enough to be able to predict its actions, but I absolutely felt Russia was going to invade, and it's consistent with my understanding of the mechanic of how it works. You know, until you deconstruct what leads to that behavior, you know, not just as an aberration, but over and over and over, then there's very little chance of democratic culture emerging.
China's
Jonathan,
definitely
do you
looking
want to close it out with a...
Yeah, I was going to say China's definitely looking at what we're doing with Russia and Ukraine, and so, you know, if you want to deter China for at least the time being, you need to support Ukraine as much as possible. That's just a given for me. Look, some absolutely fantastic fundraisings taking place. Let's try and get, I don't know, like Johnny FD over 1,000 by the end of today would be amazing. Silicon Curtain needs to get towards the 2,000. And likewise, anything that goes to my one is still open, so please keep contributing, and they will go to those who need it within the group. I mean, this is a group of people, like-minded people, who have come together to do the right things for Ukraine. So let's help us get there, and let's get this thing done. They were hoping that this might get done by something like the 9th of January, I think. Jonathan and Johnny was the date, something like that. But
I think it's a good chance of that. You know, we're on every day, and I think at least I'll get close to my target. I'm hoping by Christmas Day. I'm pretty keen to do that.
Yeah, and actually Claire was speaking to me earlier saying actually it's looking like they're hoping to do it before Christmas if we keep going at this rate. So that would be absolutely amazing. Can I just say a big thank you before I hand it over to you guys to all of the people who have contributed: BTC Bandit, Goose Springsteen, Johnny Nedregard,
great comments from Goose. You know, he's really on fire today.
Ida, Kevin Forst, all of the people, thank you so much. And Goose has thrown in a final one, you know, just we're trying to wrap up. China doesn't need to invade because it has the economic heft to dominate the world system and corrupt our democracies without firing shots.
Some truth in there. Yeah, there is definitely some truth in there.
Yeah, and in fact, Russia. I said, in fact, Goose, my point has long been Russia did not need to invade Ukraine. If they'd taken all the money they spent on Ukraine and spent that on troll farms and bot farms, they could have. I was going to swear there, screwed up all the democracies around the world. They would have, more. They could have done far more damage than what they've done with the war.
They could have just used that money to improve their own damn country and their economy, and everything would have been better. I mean, the amount of money they've spent on the invasion of Ukraine, they could have made their own country incredibly in a better position. And for every Russian who, I don't understand why that is not in their mind, that Putin just wasted their future.
Such a good and obvious point, Johnny.
Several World Cups every year, and
imagine those hundreds of billions spent on infrastructure right across the east, like you're stretching the whole of that massive country. That needs in the regions needs that infrastructure. They could have done that, taken around and going, do you know what? We're going to spank a load of money. It's kind of like the New Deal, Second World War, America. Let's do an economic stimulus in the country. Let's go absolutely crazy, build loads of stuff, make sure the welfare system's absolutely sorted. But instead, we're going to just go and spend that on infantry fighting vehicles that we're going to get blown up in Ukraine, and spend that on like attracting people to go and fight a war that they're going to die in. Brilliant. Well done, Russia.
Yeah. Well done.
Absolutely senseless.
Well, thank you two for having me on. Appreciate it.
It's great, Johnny,
for donating, and it's been a pleasure.
It's great seeing you again. And tomorrow we are hopefully going to have Rick the Ukrainian on. We're going to be kicking off at the slightly later time of 3 o'clock tomorrow. Rick will have some views on this. We'll pick up a couple of themes that come up today and dig into them with Rick tomorrow. We're still yet to announce the guest for Thursday and Friday, but we have got episodes every day this week, and we look forward to you joining us for those. Jonathan, thanks for hosting us once again.
Yeah, no problem. Thank you, everybody. And please check out those donor links and make sure that you contribute to the campaigns. It's what this is all about. So thank you, Jonathan, for putting this together.
Thank you, guys.